Hello, our little hellhounds. Welcome back to Hellhounds Bedtime Stories. We're your host, Cerberus. Cerberus. Carabas, well, also known as Cerberus. Anyhow, today we decided to do something special for you guys. Yes, well, it's not too special, but something to tie in the Halloween spirit. Yes, the Halloween spirit, something that's younger than all of us put together. Now, brother, it's the season, so let's just enjoy it. Very well. Anyhow, every single year, we kind of want to do this compilation video and put it together for Halloween. It will be made up of all your favorite videos. That's right. So all the videos that are most viewed, most liked, and, well, most commented on. That's right. Those are the parameters we will be looking at in the next coming year. So next year, the compilation will be different, but only for select videos. Unfortunately, this year we only had the 3, and we don't have a lot of subscribers, so not a lot of viewers. But we would like to work on that. Exactly! So make sure to hit that big red subscribe button down below. It is very much appreciated. And make sure to spread these spooky stories around so we can equally enjoy them. Was that absolutely necessary? Yeah, we're just trying to have some fun here. Hey, I get to do what I want, just like you guys do. Anyway, let's get into this month's compilation. And we wish everyone a happy Halloween! Today, we are going to read The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my book's surcease of sorrow from the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless the here forevermore. And the silking, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door." Some late visitors entreating entrance at my chamber door. This is it and nothing more. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, or "Madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the window, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mine of lord or lady perched upon my chamber door, perched upon a bust of palace just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the continents it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art short, no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lord name is on the night's plutonium shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answers little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven sitting lonely on the placid bust spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour, nothing further than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, if what it utters is its only stock in store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his song one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking, nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thou God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, and nenthee, from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind of nenthee, forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted. Tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels named Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels named Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign in parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest, in the night's plutonium shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit thy bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming through his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall it be lifted nevermore. Today we are going to be reading The Music of Eric Zann by H.P. Lovecraft. I have examined maps of the city with the greatest care, yet have never again found the Rue de Sel. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know that names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all the antiquities of the place, and have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street I knew as the Rue de Sel. But despite all I have done, it remains a humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the locality where, during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I heard the music of Eric Zann. That my memory is broken, I do not wonder, for my health, physical and mental, was gravely disturbed throughout the period of my residence in the Rue de Sel, and I recall that I took none of my few acquaintances there. But that I cannot find the place again is both singular and perplexing, for it was within a half-hour's walk of the university, and was distinguished by peculiarities which could hardly be forgotten by anyone who had been there. I have never met a person who has seen the Rue de Sel. The Rue de Sel lay across a dark river bordered by precipitous, brick-blear windowed warehouses, and spanned a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along that river, as if the smoke of neighboring factories shut out the sun perpetually. The river was also odorous with evil stenches, which I have never smelled elsewhere, and which may some day help me to find it, since I should recognize them at once. Beyond the bridge were narrow, cobbled streets with rails, and then came the ascent, at first gradual, but incredibly steep as the Rue de Sel was reached. I have never seen another street as narrow and steep as the Rue de Sel. It was almost a cliff, closed to all vehicles, consisting in several places of flights of steps, and ending at the top in a lofty ivied wall. Its paving was irregular, sometimes stone slabs, sometimes cobblestones, and sometimes bare earth, with struggling greenish vegetation. The houses were tall, peaked-roofed, incredibly old, and crazily leaning backward, forward, and sideways. Occasionally, an opposite pair, both leaning forward, almost meet across the street like an arch. And certainly, they kept most of the light from the ground below. There were a few overhead bridges from house to house across the street. The inhabitants of that street impressed me peculiarly. At first, I thought it was because they were all silent and reticent, but later decided it was because they were all very old. I do not know how I came to live on such a street, but I was not myself when I moved there. I had been living in many poor places, always evicted for want of money, until at last I came upon that tottering house in the Rue de Sel, kept by the paralytic Blandot. It was the third house from the top of the street, and by far the tallest of them all. My floor was on the 5th story, the only inhabited room there, since the house was almost empty. On the night I arrived, I heard strange music from the peaked garret overhead, and the next day asked old Blandot about it. He told me it was an old German viol player, a strange, dumb man who signed his name as Eric Zann, and who played evenings in a cheap theater orchestra, adding that Zane's desire to play in the night after his return from the theater was the reason he had chosen this lofty and isolated garret room, whose single gable window was the only point on the street from which one could look over the terminating wall at the declivity and panorama beyond. Thereafter, I heard Zann every night, and although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of the art myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music. I had heard before and concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until after a week I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance. One night, as he was returning from his work, I intercepted Zann in the hallway and told him that I would like to know him and be with him when he played. He was a small, lean, bent person with shabby clothes, blue eyes, grotesque, satire-like face, and nearly bald head. And at my first words seemed both angered and frightened. My obvious friendliness, however, finally melted him, and he grudgingly motioned to me to follow him up the dark, creaking and rickety attic stairs. His room, one of the only two in this steeply pitched garret, was on the west side, toward the high wall that formed the upper end of the street. Its size was very great, and seemed greater because of its extraordinary bareness and neglect. Of furniture, there was only one narrow iron bedstead, a dingy washstand, a small table, a large bookcase, an iron music rack, and 3 old-fashioned chairs. Sheets of music were piled in disorder about the floor. The walls were of bare boards and probably had never been plastered, whilst the abundance of dust and cobwebs made the place seem more deserted than inhabited. Evidently, Eric Zan's world of beauty lay in some far cosmos of imagination. Motioning me to sit down, the dumb man closed the door, turned the large wooden bolt, and lighted a candle to augment the one he had brought with him. He now removed his veil and from its moth-eaten covering, and taking it, seated himself in the least uncomfortable of the chairs. He did not employ the music rack, but offering no choice and playing from memory, enchanted me for over an hour with strains I had never heard before, strains which must have been of his own devising. To describe their exact nature is impossible for one unversed in music. They were kind of fugue, with recurrent passages of the most captivating quality, but to me were notable for the absence of any of the weird notes I had heard from my room below on other occasions. Those haunting notes I had remembered and had often hummed and whispered inaccurately to myself. So when the player at length laid down his bow, I asked him if he would render some of them. As I begun my request, the wrinkled, satire-like face lost the bored placidity it had possessed during the playing, and seemed to shew the same curious mixture of anger and fright which I had noticed when first I accosted the old man. For a moment I was inclined to use persuasion, regarding rather lightly the whims of senility, and even tried to awaken my hostess' weirder mood by whistling a few of the strains to which I had listened the night before. But I did not pursue this course for more than a moment, for when the dumb musician recognized the whistled air, his face grew suddenly distorted with an expression wholly beyond analysis, and his long, cold, bony right hand reached out to stop my mouth and silence the crude imitation. As he did this, he further demonstrated his eccentricity by casting a startled glance toward the lone curtained window, as if fearful of some intruder, a glance doubly absurd, since the garret stood high and inaccessible above all the adjacent roofs, this window being the only point on the steep street, as the concierge had told me, from which one could see over the wall at the summit. The old man's glance brought Blondin's remark to my mind, and with a certain capriciousness I felt a wish to look out over the wide and dizzying panorama of moonlit roofs and city lights beyond the hilltop, which of all the dwellers in the Rue d'Isle only this crabbed musician could see. I moved toward the window and would have drawn aside the nondescript curtains when With a frightened rage even greater than before, the dumb lodger was upon me again, this time motioning with his head towards the door as he nervously strove to drag me thither with both hands. Now thoroughly disgusted with my host, I ordered him to release me and told him I would go at once. His clutch relaxed, and as he saw my disgust and offense, his own anger seemed to subside. He tightened his relaxing grip, but this time in a friendly manner, forcing me into a chair, then, with an appearance of wistfulness, crossing to the litter table, where he wrote many words with a pencil, in the labored French of a foreigner. The note, which he finally handed me, was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. Zann said that he was old, lonely, and afflicted with strange fears and nervous disorders connected with his music and with other things. He had enjoyed my listening to his music and wished I would come again and not mind his eccentricities, but he could not play to another his weird harmonies, and could not bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in his room touched by another. He had not known until our hallway conversation that I could overhear his playing in my room, and now asked me if I would arrange with Blenda to take a lower room where I could not hear him in the night. He would, he wrote, defray the difference in rent. As I sat deciphering the execrable French, I felt more lenient toward the old man. He was a victim of physical and nervous suffering, as was I, and my metaphysical studies had taught me kindness. In the silence there came a slight sound from the window. The shutter must have rattled in the night wind, and for some reason I started almost as violently as did Edgar. So when I had finished reading, I shook my host by the hand and departed as a friend. The next day, Blendon gave me a more expensive room on the third floor between the apartments of an aged moneylender and the room of a respectable upholsterer. There was no one on the fourth floor. It was not long before I found that Zann's eagerness for my company was not as great as it had seemed. While he was persuading me to move down from the fifth story, he did not ask me to call on him, and when I did call, he appeared uneasy and played listlessly. There was always at night. In the day he slept and would admit no one. My liking for him did not grow, though the attic room and the weird music seemed to hold an odd fascination for me. I had a curious desire to look out of that window over the wall and down the unseen slope at the glittering roofs and spires, which must lie outspread there. Once I went up to the garret during the theater hours when Zann was away, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing was to overhear the nocturnal playing of the dumb old man. At first I would tiptoe up to my old fifth floor. Then I grew bold enough to climb the last creaking staircase to the peaked garret. There in the narrow hall outside the bolted door with the covered keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with undeniable dread, the dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not that the sounds were hideous, for they were not, but that they held vibration suggesting nothing on this globe of earth, and that at certain intervals they assumed a symphonic quality, which I could hardly conceive as produced by one player. Certainly, Erickson was a genius of wild power. As the weeks passed, the playing grew wilder, whilst the old musician acquired an increasing haggardness and furtiveness pitiful to behold. He now refused to admit me at any time, and shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. Then one night, as I listened at the door, I heard the shrieking viol swell into a chaotic babble of sound, a pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own shaking sanity had there not come from behind that barred portal a piteous proof that the horror was real, the awful, inarticulate cry which only a mute can utter, and which rises only in moments of the most terrible fear or anguish. I knocked repeatedly at the door, but received no response. After I waited in the black hallway, shivering with cold and fear, till I heard the poor musician's feeble effort to rise from the floor by the aid of a chair. Believing him just conscious after a fainting fit, I renewed my rapping at the same time, calling out my name reassuringly. I heard Zann stumble to the window and close both shutter and sash, then stumbled to the door, with which he falteringly unfastened to admit me. This time his delight at having me present was real, for his distorted face gleamed with relief, while he clutched at my coat as a child clutches at his mother's skirts. Shaking pathetically, the old man forced me into a chair, whilst he sank into another, beside which his viol and bow lay carelessly on the floor. He sat for some time inactive, nodding oddly, but having a paradoxical suggestion of intense and frightened listening. Subsequently, he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to a chair by the table, wrote a brief note, handed it to me, and returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and insensibly. The note implored me, in the name of mercy, and for the sake of my own curiosity, to wait where I was while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. It was perhaps an hour later, while I was still waited, and while the old musician's feverishly written sheets still continued to pile up, that I saw Zann start as from the hint of a horrible shock. Unmistakably, he was looking at the curtained window and listening shudderingly. Then, I half fancied I heard a sound myself, though it was not a horrible sound, but rather an exquisitely low and infinitely distant music note, suggesting a player in one of the neighboring houses, or in some abode beyond the lofty wall over which I had never been able to look. Upon Zann, the effect was terrible, for dropping his pencil suddenly, he rose, seized his viol, and commenced to rend the night with the wildest playing I had ever heard from his bow, save when listening at the barred door. It would be useless to describe the playing of Zann. On that dreadful night, it was more horrible than anything I had ever overheard, because I could now see the expression on his face, and could realize that this time the motive was stark fear. He was trying to make a noise to ward something off or down something out. What I could not imagine, awesome though I felt it must be. The playing grew fantastic, delirious, and hysterical, yet kept to the last of the qualities of supreme genius which I knew this strange old man possessed. I recognized the air. It was a wild Hungarian dance, popular in the theaters, and I reflected it for a moment that this was the first time I had ever heard Zann play the work of another composer. Louder and louder, wilder and wilder, mounted the shrieking and whining of that desperate viol. The player was dipping with an uncanny perspiration and twisted like a monkey, always looking frantically at the curtained window. In his frenzied strains, I could almost see shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through seething abysses of clouds and smoke and lightning, and then I thought I heard a shriller, steadier note that was not from the viol, a calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from far away in the west. At this juncture, the shutter began to rattle in a howling night wind, which had sprung up outside as if in answer to the mad playing within. Zann's screaming viol now outdid itself, emitting sounds I had never thought a viol could emit. The shutter rattled more loudly, unfastened, and commenced slamming against the window. Then the glass broke, shiveringly under the persistent impacts, and the chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter and rustling the sheets of paper on the table where Zann had begun to write out his horrible secret. I looked at Zann and saw that he was past conscious observation. His blue eyes were bulging glassily and sightless, and the frantic playing had become a blind mechanical unrecognizable orgy that no pen could even suggest. A sudden gust, stronger than the others, caught up the manuscript and bore it toward the window. I followed the flying sheets in desperation, but they were gone before I reached the demolished panes. Then I remembered my old wish to gaze from this window, the only window in the Rue d'Assel, from which one might see the slope beyond the wall, and the city outspread beneath. It was very dark, but the city lights always burned, and I expected to see them there amidst the rain and wind. Yet when I looked from the highest of all gable windows, while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled with the night wind, I saw no city spread below and no friendly lights gleaming from remembered streets, but only the blackness of space, illimitable, unimagined space, alive with motion and music, and having no semblance to anything on earth. And as I stood there looking in terror, the wind blew out both the candles in the ancient peaked garret, leaving me in savage, impenetrable darkness, with chaos and pandemonium before me, and the demon madness of that night baying viol behind me. I staggered back in the dark, without the means of striking a light, crashing against the table, overturning a chair, and finally groping my way to the place where the blackness screamed with shocking music. To save myself and Eric Zann, I could at least try whatever the powers opposed to me. Once I thought some chill thing brushed me, and I screamed! But my scream could not be heard above that hideous viol sung out of the blackness. The madly song bow struck me, and I knew I was close to the player. I felt a head touch the back of Zann's chair, and then found and shook his shoulder in effort to bring him to his senses. He did not respond, and still the viol shrieked on without slackening. I moved my hand to his head, whose mechanical nodding I was able to stop, and shouted in his ear that we must both flee from the unknown things of the night, but he neither answered me nor abated the frenzy of his unuttered music. While all through the garret strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness and babble. When my hand touched his ear, I shuddered, though I knew not why, till I felt the still face, the ice-cold, stiffened, unbreathing face, whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly into the void, and then by some miracle, finding the door and the large wooden bowl, I plunged wildly away from that glassy-eyed thing in the dark, and from ghoulish howling of that accursed viol, whose fury increased even as I plunged. Leaping, floating, flying down those endless stairs through the dark house, racing mindlessly out into the narrow, steep, and ancient street of steps and tottering houses, clattering down steps and over cobbles to the lower streets in the Puget Canyon-walled river, panting across the great dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards. We know all these are terrible impressions that linger with me, and I recall that there was no wind, and that the moon was out, and that all the lights of the city twinkled. Despite my most careful searches and investigations, I have never since been able to find the Rue d'Assel, but I am not wholly sorry, either for this or for the loss in undreamable abysses of the closely written sheets, which alone could have explained the music of Eric Zann.
And today we are going to be reading Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones. This is collected from Folklore and retold by Alvin Schwarts. Drawings by Stefan Gamel. So, for those who are not familiar with this book, it's actually a collection of very, very short stories. So we're going to actually read multiple stories out of this for today. So the first story I'm going to read is called Faster and Faster. Sam and his cousin Bob went walking in the woods. The only sounds were leaves rustling, and now again, a bird chirping. "It's so quiet here," Bob whispered, But that soon changed. After a few minutes, the two boys started whooping and hollering and chasing one another around. Sam ducked behind a tree when Bob came by. Sam jumped out at him. Then Bob raced ahead and hid behind a bush. When he looked down, there at his feet was an old drum. Sam, see what I found, he called. It looks like a tom-tom. I bet it's 100 years old. Look at the red stains on it, said Sam. I bet it's somebody's blood. Let's get out of here. But Bob could not resist trying the drum. He sat on the ground and held it between his legs. He beat on it with one hand, then the other, slowly at first, and faster, almost as if he could not stop. Suddenly there were shouts in the woods and the sound of hoofbeats. A cloud of dust rose from behind a line of trees. Then men on horseback galloped toward them. Bob, let's go, Sam shouted. He began to run. Hurry! Bob dropped the drum and ran after him. Sam heard the twang of a bow firing an arrow. Then he heard Bob scream. When Sam turned, he saw Bob pitch forward dead. But there was no arrow in his body, and there was no wound. And when the police searched, there were no men on horseback, and there were no hoof prints, and there was no drum. The only sounds were leaves rustling, and now and again a bird chirping. Just let that settle in. Creepy. Okay, so here is the next story we're going to be reading. It's called Just Delicious. George Flint loved to eat. Each day at noon, he closed his camera shop for 2 hours and went home for a big lunch. His wife, Mina, cooked for him. George was a bully, and Mina was a timid woman who did everything he asked because she was afraid of him. On his way home for lunch one day, George stopped at the butcher shop and bought a pound of liver. He loved liver. He would have Mina cook it for dinner that night. Despite all his complaints about her, she was a very good cook. While George ate his lunch, Mina told him that a rich old woman in town had died. Her body was in the church next door. It was in an open coffin. Anyone who wanted to see her could. As usual, George was not interested in what Mina had to say. I've got to go back to work, he told her. After he left, Mina began to cook the liver. She added vegetables and spices and simmered it all afternoon, just the way George liked it. When she thought it was done, she cut off a small piece and tasted it. It was delicious, the best she had ever made. She ate a second piece, then a third. It was so good she could not stop eating it. It was only when the liver was all gone that she thought of George. He would be coming home soon. What would he do when he found that she had eaten all the liver? Some men would laugh, but not George. He would be angry and mean, and she did not want to face that again. But where could she get another piece of liver that late in the day? Then she remembered the old woman lying in the church next door waiting to be buried. George said he had... Whoa, did I miss a page? Oh, waiting to be buried. Wow, that is a weird way to cut that. Okay. I don't remember it being cut like that. So I'm assuming he ate. George said he never had a better dinner. Have some liver, Mina, he said. It's delicious. I'm not hungry, she said. You finish it. That night, after George had fallen asleep, Mina sat in bed, trying to read. But all she could think about was what she had done. Then she thought she heard a woman's voice. Who has my liver? It asked. Who has it? Was it her imagination? Was she dreaming? Now the voice was closer. Who has my liver? It asked. Who has it? Mina wanted to run. No, she whispered. I don't have it. I don't have your liver. Now the voice was right next to her. Who has my liver? It asked. Who has it? Mina froze with terror. She pointed to George. He does, she said. He has it. Suddenly the light went out and George screamed and screamed. Now this one's a good one because it reminds me so much of our Little Hellhounds. Don't you agree?
I actually do agree, honestly. It really does. The title, The Black Dog, is actually very fitting for this, don't you think?
Yes, that's why I wanted to read it. Anyway, like we said, the title is The Black Dog. It was 11 o'clock at night. Peter Rothenberg was in bed on the second floor of the old house where he lived alone. It had gotten so chilly he went downstairs to turn up the heat. As Peter was on his way back to bed, a black dog ran down the stairs. It passed him and disappeared into the darkness. Where did you come from? Peter said. He had never seen that dog before. He turned on all the lights and looked in every room. He could not find the dog anywhere. He went outside and brought in the two watchdogs he kept in the backyard. But they acted as if they were the only dogs in the house. The next night, again at 11 o'clock, Peter was in his bedroom. He heard what sounded like a dog walking around in the room above him. He dashed upstairs and threw open the door. The room was empty. He looked under the bed. He looked in the closet. Nothing. But when he got back into his bedroom, he heard a dog running down the stairs. It was the black dog. He tried to follow it, but again, he could not find where it had gone. From then on, every night at 11, Peter heard the dog walking in the room above him. The room was always empty, but after he left, the dog would come out of hiding, run down the stairs, and disappear. One night, Peter's neighbor waited with him for the dog. At the usual time, they heard it above them. Then they heard it on the stairs. When they went out into the hall, it was standing at the foot of the stairs looking up at them. The neighbor whistled and the dog wagged its tail. Then it was gone. Things went on this way until the night Peter decided to bring his watchdogs into the house again. Maybe this time they would find the black dog and drive it away. Just before 11, he took them up to his bedroom and left the door open. Then he heard the black dog moving around above him. His dogs pricked up their ears and ran to the door. Suddenly, they bared their teeth and snarled and backed away. Peter could not see the black dog or hear it, but he was sure that it had entered his room. His dog barked and snapped. They darted forward nervously, then backed away again. Suddenly, one of them yelped. It began bleeding, then dropped to the floor. Its neck torn open. A minute later, it was dead. Peter's other dog backed into a corner, whimpering. Then everything was still. Then everything was still. The next night, Peter's neighbor came back with a pistol. Again, they waited in his bedroom. At 11 o'clock, the black dog came down the stairs as before. It looked up at them and wagged its tail. When they started toward it with the pistol, it growled and disappeared. That was the last Peter saw of the black dog, but did not mean that the dog was gone. Now and then, always at 11, he heard it moving around above him. Once he heard it running down the stairs, he never managed to see it again, but he knew that it was there. Alright, I think we got little bit more time for two stories, don't you think?
Yeah, I think we have the time for that. We're not running too late here. Yes, I think we can do two more. It looks like the one is actually fairly short for you.
Yes, I do agree on this one. Alright, this next story is called Like Cat's Eyes. As Jim Brand lay dying, his wife left him with his nurse and went into the next room to rest. She sat in the dark, staring into the night. Suddenly, Mrs. Brand saw headlights come rapidly up the driveway. Oh no, she thought, I don't want visitors now. Not now, but it wasn't a car bringing a visitor. It was an old hearse with maybe half a dozen small men hanging from the side. At least that's what it looked like. The hearse screeched to a stop. The men jumped off and stared up at her, their eyes glowing with a soft yellow light like a cat's eyes. She watched with horror as they disappeared into the house. An instant later, they were back, lifting something into the hearse. Then they drove off at high speed, wheels squealing, the gravel in the driveway flying in all directions. At that moment, the nurse came in to say that Jim Brand had died. Told you that was short. Hey, we need one more. This one should scare the pants off of people. This is a story called Harold. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months, then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, it was boring. All day the two men tended to their cows. At night they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. Let's make a doll the size of a man, he said. It would be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare away the birds. It should look like Harold, Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's and tiny eyes like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night, they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in his crazy voice, "Very slowly." They both would laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick him or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, which they both were sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you better eat it, or else." Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching it when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," said Thomas, "and that would be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind for now. Let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in a corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then the dog grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten into Harold and were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning, they would put Harold out in the garden, and each night they would bring him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imaginations," Alfred replied. "We have been up here on this mountain too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth, like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night long he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in the far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down in the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing. But when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told one another. "After all, what could a doll do?" They drew straws to see which one would go back. It was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said. Alfred walked on towards the valley. When Alfred came to the rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He did not see him anywhere. But he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. Oh, that's a keeper. Ah, what a good story.
Yes, I do believe this book has quite a few good short stories in it. But maybe next time we'll choose something else.
Hey, this isn't that bad. This is great for the little ones.
Yeah, I remember this actually being quite scary when we were young.
Yeah, that's true, but I think we gotta do our outro. Should I just roll us out?
Yes, I think we should keep it as one person does the intro, and that same person will do the outro as well.
All right, very good. Now, our little hellhounds, I hope you enjoyed Scary Stories 3 More Tales to Chill Your Bones. Collected from Folklore and retold by Alvin Schwarts, drawings by Stephen Gremel. Or Gamel. Now, we wish all of our little hellhounds a pleasant dreams.